For 80 years, the most studied man in modern history kept one secret buried so deep that no historian, no biographer, no wartime spy ever cracked it. They documented his every speech. They mapped his every decision. They wrote thousands of books trying to explain how one man dragged the entire world into the dark. And yet, the answer to the oldest question about him, the question of what was actually happening inside his body, inside his blood, inside the very code that built him, sat untouched on a piece of furniture in a museum in Pennsylvania. A stain on a couch. Dried blood, soaked into fabric, cut from the sofa where he put a pistol to his head in a bunker beneath Berlin in April of 1945. And in 2025, a team of scientists finally did the one thing no one had ever been allowed to do. They sequenced Adolf Hitler's DNA. And what they found did not just rewrite the medical history of the most infamous human being who ever lived. It detonated 3 of the biggest myths about him at once. And then, almost immediately, the scientists themselves started begging the world not to misunderstand what they had discovered. Because the results were disturbing, but not for the reason you think. Let me take you back to where this blood actually came from, because the journey of this sample is almost as strange as what was hidden inside it. When the war in Europe ended, American soldiers poured into the ruins of the Reich, and one of them was a colonel named Roswell Rosengren, a man who served in General Eisenhower's information office. He walked into the Führer bunker, the underground concrete tomb where Hitler had spent his final days, and he found the sofa. The same sofa where, on the 30th of April, the dictator had ended his own life with a gunshot. And like so many soldiers did in those chaotic weeks, he took a souvenir. He cut a piece of the blood-stained fabric clean off the couch and carried it home to the United States. For decades, that scrap of cloth was just a curiosity, a grim relic, the kind of thing that gets passed around and eventually lands in a private collection. It ended up at the Gettysburg Museum of History, where the curator kept it as a piece of the darkest chapter of the 20th century. Nobody thought of it as data. Nobody thought of it as a key. It was just blood on fabric. Until a team of researchers realized that blood on fabric is exactly what modern genetics has spent the last 20 years learning how to read. But here is the first problem they had to solve, and it is bigger than it sounds. You cannot just walk up to an 80-year-old bloodstain, swab it, and announce to the world that it belonged to Hitler. Think about how many hands had touched that couch. Think about how many people had been in that bunker. A bloodstain is not a name tag. So before any of the explosive findings you came here for could mean anything at all, the scientists had to prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this blood actually belonged to the man they thought it did. And the way they did it is genuinely clever. They didn't just trust the story of the souvenir. They went hunting for living relatives. A journalist named Jean-Paul Mulders had spent years tracking down men who still carried Hitler's paternal bloodline, men descended from the same male ancestors, which meant they would carry the same Y chromosome. The chromosome passed down almost unchanged from father to son across generations. If the blood on that couch carried the same Y chromosome signature as those verified living relatives, then the chain was sealed. And it matched. Not once, but across 4 separate rounds of DNA sequencing, cross-checked against the relatives, refined and tested over a span of roughly 8 years of painstaking forensic work. This was not a weekend lab project. This was nearly a decade of one of the most careful authentication efforts ever attempted on a historical sample. And leading the interpretation of the results was a geneticist, whose name you may already know if you follow this kind of work. Dr. Turi King, the same scientist who famously identified the lost bones of King Richard III buried under a parking lot in England. If anyone on Earth knew how to pull truth out of degraded, ancient, contaminated DNA, it was her. So when the authentication finally locked into place, the team knew something that no historian had ever been able to say with certainty. They were holding the genetic blueprint of Adolf Hitler, and now they could finally ask the questions. The first question they answered destroys a myth that has haunted Hitler's story since before the war even ended. For decades, there was a persistent, almost obsessive rumor that Hitler, the man who built an entire genocidal ideology around so-called racial purity, the man who murdered 6 million Jews, was himself secretly part Jewish. The story went like this. His father's mother, his grandmother, had worked as a servant in a household, and the rumor claimed she became pregnant by a Jewish man in that house, making Hitler's own grandfather Jewish. This idea even had a name among historians. It was called the Frankenberger thesis, and it gained real traction because it was first pushed into the open by a senior Nazi official writing his memoirs while awaiting execution after the war. For generations, people whispered about it, wrote about it, built theories on top of it because there was something almost poetic about the idea that the architect of the Holocaust might have been hunting his own ancestry. But poetry is not evidence. And the DNA gave a flat, cold, final answer. The Y chromosome from that bloodstain matched the Y chromosome of his verified male line relatives perfectly. And here is why that detail matters so much, because this is the part most people miss. If somewhere back in that paternal line there had been an outside father, a man who was not the official grandfather, then the Y chromosome would not match. The chain would break, but it didn't break. It held, which means the rumor of a hidden Jewish grandfather, the story that survived 80 years of retelling, simply collapsed. There was no Frankenberger. There was no secret. The most repeated conspiracy about Hitler's blood was, in the end, just a story. And while they were at it, the same evidence quietly killed a second myth, the one that refuses to die no matter how many times it is disproven. The idea that Hitler somehow escaped. You have heard the theories. He slipped out of the bunker, fled to South America, lived out his days in hiding in Argentina or Brazil under a false name. Documentaries have been built on it. Books have sold millions on it. But think about what this sample actually proves. This was blood taken from the couch in the bunker where he died, authenticated against his own living relatives. The very existence of a verified Hitler bloodstain in that room, at that moment, slams the door on the escape fantasy. The curator who provided the sample put it bluntly. This establishes beyond a shadow of a doubt that he died in that bunker in 1945. The man did not flee to a beach in Argentina. He died in the concrete dark, exactly where the historical record always said he did. 2 myths, gone on the strength of a few molecules pulled from a soldier's souvenir. But none of that is why this story exploded across the world. None of that is the disturbing part. The disturbing part is what the DNA revealed about Hitler's own body, and about his mind. And to understand it, you have to understand a strange medical mystery that has trailed Hitler for over a century. Long before anyone could read a genome, there were whispers about his body. There was a wartime song, sung by Allied soldiers, that openly mocked him for supposedly having only one testicle. People laughed at it, treated it as crude propaganda, a way to humiliate the enemy. But here's the thing that turns the joke cold. There was a real medical document behind it. Back in 1923, after Hitler's failed attempt to seize power in Munich, he was arrested and sent to prison. And when he arrived, a doctor examined him and wrote down something specific in the medical report. He noted that Hitler's right testicle was undescended. At the time, it was just a clinical footnote, a small abnormality recorded and forgotten. For 100 years, it sat there as a piece of trivia. And then the DNA came back, and that 100-year-old footnote suddenly became a clue that pointed at something much larger. Because deep inside Hitler's genetic code, the scientists found a mutation on a gene called ProK2. And that single broken gene is the thread that ties everything together. A mutation in ProK2 is associated with a rare genetic condition called Kallmann syndrome. Now, if you have never heard of Kallmann syndrome, here's what it actually does, in plain language. It disrupts the body's hormonal signaling, specifically the signals that are supposed to kick the body into puberty. People with this condition often experience delayed or even absent puberty because the brain isn't sending the chemical messages that tell the body to mature and produce sex hormones properly. In men, this can mean dramatically low testosterone. It is linked to undescended testicles, exactly what that prison doctor wrote down in 1923. And in some cases, it is associated with abnormally small genital development, including what is medically described as a micropenis. There's also another strange signature of the condition, one that almost nobody around Hitler would have known to look for. Kallmann syndrome frequently comes with an impaired or completely absent sense of smell. A man who may never have properly smelled the world around him, and who may have carried a body that never fully developed the way he so desperately wanted the world to believe a master race should. The same man who stood in front of millions and preached about biological perfection and Aryan supremacy may have been carrying, in his own cells, a genetic condition that left his body underdeveloped and his hormones broken. And for the historians on the project, this cracked open a question that had puzzled them for their entire careers. One of them put it this way: no one had ever really been able to explain why Hitler was so deeply uncomfortable around women throughout his life, why he seemed to avoid genuine intimacy, why his relationships with women were so strange and so few. And suddenly, here was a possible biological answer that had been hiding in his blood the entire time. But hold on, because if you are paying attention, you have probably already spotted the problem. And so did the critics, almost the moment the documentary aired. If Kallmann syndrome blocks puberty, if it suppresses testosterone, then how do you explain the most recognizable face in the history of the world? The mustache. The man is infamous for facial hair. Facial hair is one of the clearest signs that a man went through puberty and produced testosterone. And it goes further. The only known recording of Hitler speaking in a normal, relaxed voice reveals a fairly deep adult tone, not the higher pitch you might expect from someone whose body never matured. So critics pounced. How can you claim this man never properly went through puberty when he grew a mustache and spoke in a deep voice? It is a fair and sharp objection, and it is exactly the kind of detail that separates a responsible look at this story from cheap sensationalism. The honest answer is that Kallmann syndrome exists on a spectrum. It is not all or nothing. Some people with the condition experience partial development, incomplete puberty, a body that matures in some ways and not others. So it is entirely possible to carry the genetic markers, to have an undescended testicle and disrupted hormones, while still growing facial hair and developing a deep voice. But, and this is the part the clickbait headlines will never tell you, possible is not the same as proven. And that gap between what is possible and what is certain is where this entire story gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely dangerous. Because there was a second set of findings. And these are the ones that sent the internet into a frenzy. The scientists didn't just look at Hitler's physical development, they ran his DNA through what are called polygenic risk scores. Now, I need you to really understand what these are, because if you misunderstand them, and almost everyone did, you will walk away believing something that is simply not true. A polygenic risk score works like this. Scientists have studied huge populations of people and identified thousands of tiny genetic variants that, when they pile up together, are statistically associated with a higher likelihood of certain conditions. It is not one gene. It is the accumulated weight of thousands of them, added up into a single score that tells you, roughly, where a person sits on a probability curve compared to the general population. And when they ran Hitler's DNA through this analysis, the numbers were staggering. According to the documentary, he scored in the top 1% for autism, top 1% for schizophrenia, top 1% for bipolar disorder. His scores were described as sitting at the very highest end of the curve for each of these conditions. And his risk markers for depression and ADHD were elevated as well. Sit with that for a second. The man responsible for the most systematic horror of the 20th century carried genetic risk markers for a stack of psychiatric and neurological conditions, every single one at the extreme edge of the human range. It is the kind of fact that feels like it explains everything. It feels like the answer. It feels like we finally found the thing that made a monster a monster. And that exact feeling, is the most dangerous thing about this entire story. Because the scientists who did this work watched the world reach for that conclusion. And they did something you almost never see. They turned around and told everyone to stop. One of the lead historians on the project, a leading expert on the Third Reich, said that when he was first shown these results, he felt, in his own words, electrified and concerned in equal measure. Electrified because of what it might reveal. Concerned because he could already see exactly how it would be misused. And he said something that I think every single person who shares this story needs to hear. He said there is no dictator gene. The genetic makeup of extremists and the genetic makeup of ordinary peaceful people is, on average, the same. There is no sequence in your DNA that turns you into a tyrant. Hitler's genome, he said, is not the blueprint of a dictator. And a geneticist from University College London drove the point home even harder. Polygenic risk scores, he explained, tell you something about populations, about large groups of people, not about individuals. You cannot point at one person's score and diagnose them, especially not a dead man who cannot be examined, cannot be tested, cannot be asked a single question. A high polygenic score for autism does not mean Hitler had autism. A high score for schizophrenia does not mean he was schizophrenic. These are probabilities measured across millions, not verdicts handed down on one man. And here is the part that should genuinely make you uncomfortable, because it is the real disturbing core of this story. The danger is not what Hitler's DNA says about Hitler. The danger is what people will do with the idea that you can read evil in a genome. Because if you let yourself believe that autism or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder somehow live in the same genetic neighborhood as history's greatest monster, you are one short step away from stigmatizing millions of living people who carry those exact conditions and who have never harmed a soul. You are reviving the same poisonous logic, that biology determines worth, that genes decide who is dangerous, that Hitler himself used to justify mass murder. That is the irony so sharp it could cut you. The misuse of this DNA study would be a return to the precise thinking that made the Holocaust possible. And there is one more reason to slow down before you treat any of this as settled fact, and it is the reason that almost never makes it into the viral clips. As of the time this research was revealed to the public, the findings had not been peer-reviewed. They had not been published in a scientific journal. They were presented in a documentary, a well-produced, carefully researched documentary involving serious scientists, yes, but a documentary nonetheless. And in real science, the documentary is not the finish line. The finish line is when other independent experts, who had nothing to do with the project, get to tear the work apart. Check the methods, question the assumptions, and try to prove it wrong. The lead geneticist said the work had been submitted to a high-profile journal, and that she hoped it would be published soon. But until that happens, until other scientists have stress-tested every claim, the honest position is that this is a powerful, fascinating, carefully assembled set of findings, and also a set of claims that has not yet survived the gauntlet that real science demands. Both of those things are true at the same time. It can be groundbreaking and unconfirmed. It can be compelling and incomplete. Holding both of those ideas in your head at once is exactly what the historians on the project asked the public to do, and almost no one did it. So let me give you the full picture, the one that survives once you strip away the shock in the headlines. We now have strong genetic evidence, authenticated over 8 years and cross-checked against living relatives, that the blood on that couch belonged to Adolf Hitler, and that he died in that bunker in 1945. We have a near certain refutation of the old myth that he carried hidden Jewish ancestry through his father's line. We have a real documented genetic mutation in the PROK2 gene that points toward Kalman syndrome, a condition that fits almost eerily with that 100-year-old prison medical report about an undescended testicle, and that may finally explain the lifelong mystery of his discomfort with intimacy and women. And we have a set of psychiatric risk scores at the absolute extreme of the human range, scores that are real, and also scores that tell us about probability across populations and absolutely cannot diagnose one specific dead man. That is the truth, not the clean, satisfying story where a broken gene explains a broken world, the messier, more honest one where biology gives us context but never gives us an excuse. Because here's the thing the entire study ultimately proves, the thing that is more unsettling than any micropenis or any risk score. It would be so comforting, wouldn't it, to believe that Hitler was a genetic accident, a 1 in a billion biological glitch, a monster built by a faulty sequence of DNA, fundamentally different from you and me at the molecular level. That belief would let us all sleep better, because it would mean that what he did could never be repeated by ordinary people. But the science says the opposite. The science says his genome could have belonged to almost anyone. His DNA was, in the words of one researcher, almost the most boring genome on the planet, until they realized whose it was. There was no mark of Cain written into his chromosomes, no biological warning label. The man who orchestrated the murder of millions carried, for the most part, a perfectly ordinary set of human genes. And that means the capacity for what he did was not locked away in some rare mutation. It was carried by a man whose biology was, in almost every meaningful way, just like everyone else's. Which raises the only question that actually matters when you put all of this down. If it wasn't his genes that made him a monster, then what was it? Because the DNA just told us, with cold genetic certainty, that the answer was never hiding in his blood. It was hiding in his choices, in his ideology, in the millions of ordinary people who chose to follow him. And that is a far more disturbing result than any single broken gene could ever be.